Welcome once again from the Forum for Youth Investment. This is Marita Irby. I am co-founder and Executive Vice President here at the Forum, and I am delighted to be your host today for this conversation. I am going to introduce you to our panelists today, a set of leaders from Palm Beach County that really have been working on multiple fronts to change the odds for children and youth. And we're going to get your panelists up here in just one moment. And if we can, perhaps, Marcia, if you can kick us off, and we'll just go across the screen from left to right with introductions.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. I'm Marcia Guthrie. I am Community Planning and Partnership Officer here at the Children's Services Council of Palm Beach County.
Hi, good afternoon. Suzette Harvey, President and CEO, Primetime, Palm Beach County.
Good afternoon. I'm Tammy Fields. I'm the Director of the Palm Beach County Youth Services Department. We're looking forward to seeing you all in Palm Beach County.
Good afternoon. This is Seth Bernstein. I'm a licensed psychologist and certified addictions professional, and I also serve at United Way of Palm Beach County as their Senior Vice President of Community Investments.
And again, Marita Irby, I'm your moderator today for this illustrious panel, and I'm going to turn it over to Seth here for just a moment to give us a little bit of the lay of the land in Palm Beach County.
Great. Thank you again, Marita, for having us on this webinar today, and thank you all participants for joining us to learn about the Palm Beach County story. So just to spend a moment of time about our community, we are the third largest population here in Florida with a little over 1.4 million residents. We are the 11th largest school district in the country, and we have one school district and one circuit for our juvenile justice and child welfare systems. We're the second largest landmass, and as you see here, at almost 2,000 square miles, 2 states in the United States can fit into Palm Beach County. We're larger than the states of Rhode Island and Delaware. As far as wealth, we have the 4th largest wealth gap in Florida. We have communities in Palm Beach that has an average median income of over $115,000, and then on the west side of our county, it's a little bit under $28,000 with a bit of poverty, 14% of poverty in the community. We're an extremely diverse population in Palm Beach County. We have over 150 languages and dialects spoken among our student population, and our breakdown of races, we have about 21% are Hispanic or Latino, and 18% are Black or African American. And our service industry is varied, but our top 3 industries are healthcare and social assistance, retail, trade, and then food services and accommodations, and like hotel service and whatnot. So it's a diverse community. We have a bit over 60% of free and reduced lunch rates among our student population, and it's kind of like a tale of 2 cities. We have the wealthiest of the wealthy and communities that do not have wealth. So it's a fascinating community to work within.
Thank you, Seth. I always hear that when I've come to visit in Palm Beach County, people sometimes get a certain view in mind when they hear Palm Beach, and often hear you all say, no, we're talking about Palm Beach County, and it really is a tale of 2 cities and multiple cities when you think about what that range looks like. So thanks for giving us that lay of the land. Let me give you a little view of the conversation that we're going to have today, and it really is a story that it unfolds over time that we're going to be exploring, starting with the dedicated funding that came in really several decades ago in the early childhood care and development space, and then evolved over time. It's a story about access and equity in the out-of-school time space, about systems of care that really build from that early childhood space all the way up through older youth. And increasingly, it is a story of strengthening and aligning partnerships. In our work here at the Forum, one of the key things we've learned about leadership development over time is that whether we're talking about young leaders or seasoned community partners, there are really 3 elements that are key, and that's the motivation to do the work, the capacity, and the opportunity. And And today's conversation is going to be about those a combination of those three things, and oftentimes starting off with, well, what was the opportunity, or what was the motivation, what was the challenge that you all were tackling there. So as we go through these strands and phases, I'm going to ask each of you to unpack for us a little bit about what was happening at that moment in time that really created the opportunity, what was the motivation for change or the challenge that you were tackling, and what capacity do you either need to draw on or build there locally to really make things happen. So let's get this story started with Marcia and the work in the early childhood space.
Okay, so what can I say about Florida? Florida has 9 special taxing districts. The Children's Services Council here in Palm Beach County is one of those districts that are focused, dedicated funding from ad valorem taxes since 1986, when CFC was established, to support programs for children and their families. Now, all of the CFCs across Florida operate a little different, but we all have this dedicated pot of funding to support services for kids and families. And so what's unique about our local Children's Services Council is our approach to investment. Primarily, the bulk of our funding is focused on early intervention, primary prevention, early intervention in the spaces of early childhood and maternal child health, as well as after school and early care and education. And with the overall aim, we have 4 primary goals that we work towards, and that our children are born healthy, are free from abuse and neglect, are ready to enter school, and that they have access to quality after school and summer programs. So it's our intent through this dedicated funding to develop a system of care, which we've been developing very actively and quite progressively since the early 2000s. Next slide. Thank you. So I made mention, so this is the distribution of the CFCs. There's one that operates a little differently, but it's still a special district in the northern part of the state, in Duval County. But here you see us right down there in Palm Beach County. We cluster and partner very closely with our neighboring CFCs. We're part of a single network, and these are these councils that operate across the state. So we've had quite...
Now, I was just going to ask Marcia, with so many different ways that these could be set up, they're special taxing districts, but why, how did Palm Beach County sort of really harness this particular opportunity, given the understanding of what the needs were in Palm Beach County? You've talked a lot about sort of where the kind of this laser focus when things got started. Can you speak a little bit to that? Right. So one of the first departments that the CFC in Palm Beach County established was a research and evaluation. And we've held pretty firmly to the premise of looking at what is the latest in terms of research, what's happening in innovation. And several years ago, our leadership at the time said we need to really be looking at what provides for the greatest return on our investments. And that was an intentional focus in thinking about early childhood and the focus on the youngest children. Primarily, the bulk of our funding, about 89% of it, goes to children in 0 to 12, with the vast majority of that being birth to 5. And so that was led by research. And we've come a long way in thinking with our community partners around the focus on early childhood. And as we continue with the story a little later on, you're going to hear about how the pipeline that we've developed have since led to connections with other pipelines as we hear about the work of the Youth Services Department. So we have a system of care here locally in our organization, but we, as a county, have developed a pipeline for services for kids beginning with early childhood and beyond, and we'll be able to share those a little later. So as I said, we have 3 primary strategies that we deploy here at CSC. One of those are direct individual and child services and healthy beginnings. And so when I talked about our focus on infant 0 to 5
and maternal child health. That happens in that space. We also have a significant amount of investment in a place-based approach that we call bridges in our local communities. But the one that we really want to focus on here today is our work around quality child care, scholarships, early care and education, and after school. And you'll get to hear more about our quality improvement system for after school when you hear later on in the story about prime time. So CFC recognized that we needed to move beyond just our investments in early intervention and created a system, an intermediary system, to support access to quality. And we have a special situation here in Palm Beach County because we also have the Early Learning Coalition. So we have a significant amount of investments to subsidize, to support the subsidy system for childcare. We know that it is a very expensive endeavor to have your children in childcare and have access to quality after school. So CFC, through its Early Learning Coalition, provides additional funds so that we can open up slots and increase access for kids to those systems of support. And one of the primary ones that we do to support children in their social emotional development space is the investment in prime time. Now, this is something that was very dedicated because we could have easily provided the funds directly to prime time to have the slots, to issue the slots, as well as be the technical assistance for the providers in the after-school arena. But we were very focused that in order for prime time to really have the profile that they have been able to garner national attention on, is that their emphasis really needed to be on quality, and that the Early Learning Coalition will deal with the access to the support. And Primetime and ELC work very hand in hand. It's a wonderful partnership, as well as how they partner with the rest of the systems, the other two systems that I briefly touched on that CFC supports. So with that, we'll have an opportunity to hear about Primetime.
Thank you. So good afternoon. I just want to reemphasize what Marcia said about data. Being a CSC-funded program now going into my 18th year, data runs programs, really drives programs, and we know that is the heart of the work as well as continuous improvement. So this is just one way that you can do quality and improvement. It's the way that Primetime is approaching it. Whatever works for your community context is important. But for here in Palm Beach County, we're very grateful for the vision of the Children's Services Council had back in the late 90s, looking around and seeing that there was really uneven quality when it came to after-school programs for our children, particularly in high-needs communities. As Seth talked about earlier, there's a huge wealth gap in our county. So the Children's Services Council was intentional in making sure that we are providing opportunities for children who may not have had a chance to have opportunities that other children have had. So when we look at the system with Early Learning Coalition and Primetime, the focus is on continuous improvement. We have created a low-stakes system that is not punitive, but is really helping those practitioners grow where they are, providing them what we want to teach them to fish and provide them with the tools to fish, not hand them fish. So it is about growing the practitioners, it's about growing the workforce. This is also a workforce issue because we understand that the adults in the room are the linchpin for the success of our children. So what we
Suzette, it's really a capacity building kind of story then, with all of these different partners in the system. So tell us how that worked.
Right. So I was jumping right into the system, and I just want to refer back to what both Seth and Marcia talked about. This is just one of many coalitions, ecosystems that have grown out of Palm Beach County and part of Birth to 22. So I just think it's very germane to the people who are coming to the national meeting because it is about youth development. So I just want to mention there's many more. And through this process of the youth planning process, we've been able to connect with so many more other coalitions and have really enriched our work. So I wanted to put that out there on the table. But this is really, it's interconnected. So you see on the top we have our funders, In addition to the Children's Services Council, we get funding from Palm Beach Youth Services that really focuses on the older youth. CSC is primarily covering, the Children's Services Council is K-5, and then we get support for our middle school. But the school districts are a really important part of this as well. The 90-plus program elementary schools, we're working with 70 of them, as well as your Boys and Girls Clubs and your YMCAs. We are the service provider for the entire county. And what makes our initiative very special is we have down here, we call them the content expert providers. We use true experts, those folks at the zoos and the science centers and the arts theaters to come in and provide our children with really enriching experience of the highest quality. This is a very unique system, and because we are not about compliance, I think that we allow these programs to explore and to grow in a very authentic and organic way. So just very briefly,
does that make?
Excuse me? Oh, right. So why do we bother to do this? Because we know that by investing in the after-school practitioner and that adult in the room, we can see the impact on young people. I'm very pleased to say that since probably 2004, Primetime has worked with the Weichert Center that is a part of the Forum for Youth Investment. We helped pilot their program quality assessment tool back in the early days and created one that works for our county. And we have seen consistent increases in quality over time, as Marsha alluded to earlier. Our system is known nationally. Our quality coaching is really held up as an exemplar. And it's easy for me to say that. I don't do the work myself, but I have an incredible staff of professionals who work one-on-one with these after-school staff to really see that change in children. In 2013, we had a study by AIR, the American Institute of Research, that showed that the work here in Palm Beach County for the kids who are in those high-quality programs, it leads to greater promotions, retainment. So we are very proud of the work that we're doing here in this sector.
So let's fast forward sort of another 10 years, because you're talking about that kind of early on in the decade and the work you've been doing since really early 2000, and see how the work and structures evolved further. Tammy, can you tell us, as we were getting into not just coordination of service, but kind of systems of care around the older youth, what was the impetus for evolution in terms of that work?
There was a significant change that occurred here in Palm Beach County when our county commissioners, our school board members, and our Children's Services Council board members saw what happened at Sandy Hook. And that created an opportunity for all of these boards to get together, and several of our juvenile judges also joined in to discuss how do we make sure an event like that does not occur in Palm Beach County. And there were numerous recommendations that came out of that gathering, which we called the Infant, Child, Youth and Young Adults Symposium. We just shorten it now to Youth Symposium. But when that occurred, several recommendations came out of that, one of which was the creation of the Youth Services Department. And the Youth Services Department is under the Board of County Commissioners. The board always supported some youth programs, but they were scattered amongst many different departments within the county. And the idea was to take all of the various initiatives and bring them under one umbrella with funding, ad valorem tax funding allocated by the Board of County Commissioners into one space for the Youth Services Department. And we opened our doors in January of 2015.
So, Tammy, this is when we got to know each other, and I remember the phone call. You were charged with getting this whole department aligned and underway and bringing all these things together, and yet you thought there was even more you could do with this opportunity. So I'm going to come back to that opportunity, motivation, capacity theme, and say, with all that on the plate to do, why did you see this as an opportunity to also do more? What was the challenge out there that you thought needed to be responded to? What else did you think you needed to help the community take on?
Well, I had the pleasure of working in the county attorney's office for 25 years prior to becoming the director of the Youth Services Department. And because I represented many different departments at that point in time, I saw how a lot of organizations did their own thing and there wasn't that coordination amongst organizations. So it became very apparent to me that we needed to make sure that we were coordinating amongst all of the various agencies within the county. There were so many wonderful initiatives that were going on. The Children's Services Council was doing a phenomenal job with that, Birth to 5. Our school district had a lot going on. Prime Time was involved in the after-school space. The United Way was working on several different collective impact initiatives. And it just seemed to me, before I could make any funding recommendations out of our Youth Services Department, we needed to have a cohesive plan that was a community plan. I did not want a plan from our department alone. It needed to be a community plan, and that was the impetus for calling you and the Forum for Youth Investment, because in doing my research, I saw what other jurisdictions like King County, Washington had done this community plan. I knew it was going to be a challenge in Palm Beach County just because of our size and our diversity, but we thought we could do it as a result of the work that had already been done during the Youth Symposium.
Well, let's get a sense of the kinds of things that were in play there, because you mentioned so many coalitions, in addition to all the departments, coalitions and collective impact initiatives and other strategic planning efforts. Seth, you were connected in a lot of those. Can you just give us highlights on a couple?
Sure. Yeah, thank you, Marita. So prior to coming to be a funder with United Way of Palm Beach County, I was a provider here in different nonprofits and the government sector for a little over 23 years or so. And, as a provider, you have the lens of, working directly, in my case, with children and families. And, the interface with the different systems can be very complex. We were still doing that. So, we really, and I in my prior work was very connected to national efforts that were going on here, state efforts that were going on here, and educational efforts that were going on here. And under the Youth Services Department, and when all of us started working on the Youth Master Plan, it brought us all together. So we were working on the national effort of My Brother's Keeper. We were working on some state assessments and efforts around behavioral health and substance abuse. As Tammy said, we, United Way in the county and others, had developed a hunger relief plan. We had a 10-year plan to end homelessness. There was also work going on in the special needs arena. And then at the same time, educationally, there were efforts going on, as Tammy and Suzette alluded to. We created a collective impact model called Achieve Palm Beach County. One of our local foundations was really the impetus to that. And that was a college access network right here for our community. It's part of the National College Access Network and part of the Florida College Access Network at this point. But it's a collective impact model for folks to access post-secondary services. And then, of course, we had the Wallace Foundation work going on. So it was a bit disjointed, and folks were doing some similar work, but in different arenas, and there was not a whole lot of communication. In fact, when we looked at the behavioral health work and did a needs assessment with our managing entity locally, there were over 25 organizations that were talking about mental health for kids and for adults. And, that's just really challenging to work with, with the leaders and the funders and the communities around. So we really needed to pull things together. And under this umbrella, it was very exciting to consider.
So I remember this when Tammy called and sort of said that the Youth Services Department needs a strategic plan, but let's think about how to do this more broadly. And it was really bringing this together with the idea of a broader countywide youth master plan and combining that with a leadership council that could connect all this. The starting point, as we challenged you and you challenged us, was to start by reading all of the strategic planning documents that had happened already. And it was over 700 pages. Luckily, it was a team member on your end that we worked with to actually get that work done. But it was over 700 pages of planning documents that Eleni plowed through in the first month of that work together to try to cut through all of that great detailed work that had been happening and think about how to even get the conversation started at another level. How do you really bring all of this together, though, is such a challenge, and communities across the country have similar kinds of coalitions and networks and departments like yours that you've got there. I'm just thinking, Tammy and Marcia, if you can walk us through a little bit just what it took to really get all of these different actors and folks working on these different initiatives literally on the same page. What did it look like to really do that so that you really could get the light shining and more of these gears kind of turning in the same directions? What did it take to really pull this together?
Well, one of the first things it took is for us to recognize that we couldn't just look at it from the various youth serving agencies. We needed to also take this out to the community. So we held a number of community conversations, 11 of them throughout our county, to be able to get the community input in our youth master plan. But the other thing that was important is that we had a visual that really explained what we were trying to achieve. And so what everybody's seeing right now is our steps to success. And we look at what it takes to get a child born healthy and all the way up to being career ready. So that could be whether they're going on to college, entering the workforce, certificate programs, etc. And we have been able to define several different elements, data points that we want to look at in order to show our success in that arena. All of those that are in green are positive factors for our youth, and the ones in red are factors that we want to avoid, but they're all points of data that we can use to track to show how we're getting our youth to a successful point.
So one of the important things in development of the youth master plan, and as Marita, as you mentioned, as we looked at the various strategic planning efforts that were going on by a number of networks and coalitions across our community, we recognized that folks in many instances were working on improving many of the same indicators that we were tracking, that when we had sat down in the youth symposium very early on in 2011 and 13 and said, why are our children in Palm Beach County not faring well in terms of graduating, when we looked at toxic stress, when we looked at even some of the indicators in the early childhood space, we recognized that there was a lot of inputs. Our provider community were actively working on many of these things, and really developing the steps to success gave us an opportunity to really pause and look at it from the child's perspective. A lot of our work previously had been about what are the institutions and systems are doing as we think about resolving complex challenges through a systems of care approach. But I think our connection and partnership with the Forum for Youth Investment, they asked us some critical questions around, well, what do you want to see in kids? What does readiness look like? And we had to get really specific about these steps to success, what it would take. So in our journey of completing our youth master plan and doing our action teams, these teams are solidly focused on these and many other indicators. So the ones that you see across the top, these are the things that we want to see in young people, but we have a whole set of conditions that we call supports for success, which are really the rungs underneath the stair steps. And those are the things that get us back to, well, what are the conditions for health and wellness? What are the conditions that need to happen in communities, within agencies, so that these indicators can be realized for kids all the way up on the continuum. So it was a different way of working, because many of our partner organizations had principles around being data driven. Even us here at the Children's Services Council, from our early inception, have been laserly focused on looking at data, looking at research and evaluation and innovation. But even for us, this was an opportunity to sit down and really think about how do we establish appropriate benchmarks and targets, and then, like Tammy said, how do we do that in balance with the actual kids and families that are being impacted and the community? And that led us to really going a step further. If we'll go to the community conversations, we said, okay, so we can look at data and we can examine these indicators and we can see what's going on, but we need to test this data. We need to be having real conversations with kids and families to know, is this data a manifestation of something else? What's really the perceptions of those who are being impacted by the services, the many services that are available in Palm Beach County? Because one of the things we thought was, maybe we don't have enough of certain things, but we recognized that we were really a service-rich community. Our challenge was that things were not aligned around mutual set of goals. And so adopting the collective impact big picture framework really gave us an opportunity to think about how do we align the work that we were doing. And so when we went out into the communities, we heard very clearly across the 11 conversations these 6 emerging themes. And we see these gears as grinding together through this collection of partnerships and this underneath this now universally accepted initiative called Birth to 22.
So
I
saw a lot of these listed on the other page, but coming back on this one, you see how some of these different initiatives really connect to those major areas that the community was identifying as key themes. Seth, Suzette, anybody want to chime in on what's it really like having the work kind of connect up into that bigger picture game plan, practically, nuts and bolts? What does it mean to be starting a new initiative like one around social emotional learning connected to a larger agenda like this?
It was very exciting. As these themes kept coming up, community after community, we were able to look at the other initiatives that were happening here and align them up, many of which, you see here in the detail under each of the themes. I do want to say that in those community conversations, many of them had rooms filled with youth. Many had more than 50% of youth that were involved in the conversations. They were even leading the table conversations and reporting out. So, we really had a strategic focus on listening to our youth, recognizing what they say as their needs, and putting it directly into the youth master plan. I remember in one community, a youth said, I just want someone to care about me and I want hope for the future. And, that really stuck with me. And another youth in an out-of-school, after-school program said they need food, F-O-O-D. And it's not just one little thing of juice and some crackers. These are 13, 14-year-old, young men and women, and they needed more. So the themes that were talked about among the community really resonated with us as we were developing our plan, and it brought us all together, which was really terrific. And now as a funder, it makes a whole lot of sense. It makes understanding what the community's needs are, and to have action teams, as Marcia talked about, action work groups of the Birth 22, we can go to different groups and learn about what the needs are from them, including our young leaders, our youth leaders that we'll hear about in a little while.
And Marita, just being in the youth development space for so long, we weren't surprised by the things the young people were saying, but it was also an opportunity to sort of refine what we do. I mean, Prime Time has been doing social and emotional learning since the very beginning. We just didn't name it. And I think sort of in this moment in time, just where we are nationally, there is a focus on social and emotional learning. But we are about connecting young people to caring adults. That is at the heart of our work. And what showed up is that kids want to find a place to belong. They need to know how to deal with conflict. They need to know how to raise their self-efficacy. And these are things that we have been doing, have the training and the capacity, but now through this Youth Master Plan, we're able to share that with other sectors, other groups heretofore that we haven't. So there's been some coming together. There's been some partnering in ways that I couldn't really have imagined a couple of years ago. And it is really through this process that is making these supports open to a wider group of children and really adults.
And I think another thing that has been very helpful is from a funder standpoint. Last year, we were able to put out $2.1 million into agencies in the community, and we named 4 of these 6 areas as areas that we wanted to support. And so it was very easy for us to make funding recommendations because we already had the information as to what our community said were their most important issues. And then this year we'll be putting out the other 2 areas in an RFP. So that was very helpful from a funder standpoint, and several of the other funders are also using the Youth Master Plan in order to make funding decisions.
That's really helpful and concrete, and I know we're going to get in just a moment to more ways that are really informed how you're doing business. And I just want to pick up on the systemic barriers piece. That was really something that so many community members talked about in the community conversations, and something that really has been a focus of your work even before you started the Birth to 22 partnership work. Has been a theme of much of the work in Palm Beach County, of how you really bring an equity lens to all of this, and explicitly in the Youth Master Plan, but just also in your own leadership development. Can you speak a little bit about leadership development overall, both in the equity work and in the young leaders that Seth just mentioned? Maybe Marcia and then Tammy.
Right. So one of the things that we recognized early on, if we went back to that, even before the formal development of the Clear Steps to Success, when we were first having conversations about what young people are impacted, we recognized that across a range of child well-being indicators, there was always this 25 to 30% of kids that, no matter if we were talking about access to childcare or graduation or post-secondary or criminal justice, there was always this 20 to 25% of kids that they were faring just much worse. And that was in communities across the county. We started to look at things geographically and said, okay, is it just because our Western communities are more removed and have less social and infrastructure supports? But it didn't really matter where these kids were living. And so very early on, we adopted this principle that equity is a right for all children, and that the Birth to 22 initiative would be focused on, yes, it's a population focus because we want to change and improve population level outcomes across in those areas, but specifically we want to consider the different experiences of the different young people that we're touching in this initiative and really understand what's at the heart of that for them. So this idea of providing targeted attention to special populations, be it however they identify, be it Black and African American, Hispanic, LGBTQ, special needs was an area that was a strong focus, and we teased those out. As we went and had community conversations, we had a conversation that was primarily youth-focused, one that was on special needs. We want to look at our children who have been court involved in the multiple systems that touch them and how those systems were really meeting their needs. And so this idea around equity is for us to really create an actionable and holistic agenda around where do we need to be creating more investments or creating more opportunities so that these populations, we can start to close the gap so that when we look across these range of indicators, we don't always have to see that those who identify as vulnerable or have been marginalized continue to fare behind the rest of the kids in the county, and that readiness and access is a right that we want for all children in Palm Beach. So in doing so, we had to take it to the people. So we took it to the youth, and we talked to them about issues of equity, and we talked about what leadership will look like, and that helped us to create formally our youth council.
And our youth council, we really realized as a result of the community conversations how much our youth could contribute. As was mentioned, many of our youth participated as facilitators in the community conversations. So we created a youth council. We were just going to call it a youth council, and the minute we got them together, they didn't like that name. There was a group of young people ranging from 11 to 22-year-olds, and they came up with the name that they were Future Leaders United for Change. And this is not just student council leaders. It's not the athletes at the school. This group are kids that are coming from many of the funded programs in the community, and they've really they've taken on so many different issues. They have developed their own priorities, including food issues, and did a planting in one of the homeless resource areas for fruit trees. They have become involved in planning a leadership summit that is coming up. And they're just an incredible group of young people who are making sure that their voice is heard. And they also hold a seat on the steering committee for Birth to 22, where they have the same voice as the adults that are on the steering committee.
So let's talk for just a minute about what difference all of this is making. I've heard you all talk about it a good deal, but first, just on that question of your own leadership practice. How has your leadership practice changed, do you think, over the last couple of years as you've been doing this work together?
I think we've gotten more integrated and much more efficient. So there were planning meetings and other advisory committees that have folded into the Birth to 22 effort. So, those of us that are multi-involved with these initiatives and efforts can now be focused more on the overall arching initiative, the Birth to 22. And we are seeing that folks in the community are coming to this umbrella organization and helping to mold into it and fold into it to make things a bit more efficient. And, I think also what we've learned is, with the Future Leaders United for Change, the youth group, that we don't want to do programming for communities without communities. And communities need to be there at the table, driving and providing input into what we do as community of funders. So I think where we've had overlap of efforts, now it's much more streamlined. Would be my first take on things.
We've heard you talk a little bit about the more funding and better informed funding. In terms of building your own leadership capacity, can someone say a word about the racial equity training? We've heard you talk about the equity agenda itself, but in terms of your own racial equity training, what's that about?
Well, as I mentioned before, we have such a focus on equity, but it's emerging work, new work for our community to really be thinking about, can we really be specific and target? And what we recognize is that organizations, we need to have capacity in order to do equity work, because it's dynamic and it's changing, and it pulls against our comfort zone. So we have been within the action teams and the leaders and the various levers that we have for Birth to 22, been having racial equity training, but we've also been doing that across the partnership sector with many of our community partners, and have begun to have those same conversations with youth, having racial equity trainings with youth as well, so we can really understand, why are we focusing on equity? Why is, what's this all about? And have a common language in which to make decisions from and move from.
Thank you.
Marita?
So as we talk about, yes, Tammy.
That was Suzette. Marita?
That was Suzette.
Yeah, I just want to mention that, making a difference, it is about the funding as well. Palm Beach County is one of 6 communities across the country that was selected for the Wallace Foundation's Partnerships for Social Emotional Learning. That's a multi-million-dollar investment in this community, and I can say quite comfortably that the work that we did through the youth planning process really helped to inform that grant. I mean, they were looking at communities that had the capacity to look at this work over the long term, and social emotional learning was one of the tenets as we looked at this plan. And I think that really helped us be selected for this initiative that we're doing with the school district. So its reach will be long. It's not only about prime time in the school district, but it's about building community.
And both attracting new funds and, as we heard Tammy talk about, informing how you're doing grant making if you're a funder there as well.
Yes.
It's definitely a key part of the story. Highlights then in terms of how it's both changed your approach to how you're providing supports in the community, and then ultimately what we're seeing in terms of promising changes in how children and youth are doing.
Well, one of the highlights is how we're able to come together and respond to emerging situations. Last year, Florida was hit by Hurricane Irma, and it was remarkable how quickly all of the components of Birth to 22 were able to come together, both to assist families and to assist nonprofit agencies. And that was done very rapidly because of the partnerships that were already established. After the unfortunate incident on February 14th in Parkland, we also came together and realized how much we needed to respond on the mental health and safety components. And we're focusing on trauma-informed care. We've also seen some progress in some of our statistics that we're very proud of. And one, we've seen a drop in the number of child abuse reports, and we've also seen some significant change in the equity gap in our graduation rates. And those things have really happened over the last year since the Youth Master Plan was published. So it's very encouraging to see that we're making progress maybe a little bit faster than some of the other jurisdictions within the state, because we're able to work together.
Thank you. I think it's always important to think about as we do this work, is it making a difference and what is the impact? And even if we are looking at things where it might be our contribution more than being able to say we can attribute it to our work, we can certainly see that those gears are starting to turn. And when you can see changes in things like beginning to close that equity gap, it starts to give you hope that all of this is really making a difference. We're going to take just a couple of minutes because we're here at time and wrapping, and have just one more thing to show after this. So I'm going to pose these two questions that we've got and see if you want to take one of them. They're both like, how do you get started questions. One is, if you didn't have a dedicated funding stream, which is where our story started today, what advice would you give to a community that was trying to do this kind of integrated aligned systems building work? And the other is, if you were trying to launch a youth master planning process, where would you start? Both stories you can hear more about at the national meeting, but for our panelists, how would you start?
Well, I think it's probably easiest for Palm Beach County to respond to the second question on how you get started, because we are very fortunate here to have that dedicated source of funding that was already present with the Children's Services Council. But when it comes to how do you get started with a youth master plan, I think the important thing is you go through and you identify all of the youth serving organizations that you can and do a dive into internet research as to the various plans that are out there and try and bring all of the partners together. What we found is once we got a core set of partners together, more people wanted to join. And as we went through the youth master planning process, we had, I believe, 67 agencies in the beginning that were part of it. We're now, in a year, we're well over 100 agencies that are involved. The other essential element is that there is community conversations. If we don't have community buy-in and hear the voice of the community, particularly the voice of the youth, I don't know that a youth master plan is going to be successful, because it is what drives it. There's times where we as adults have thought what are the priorities, and when we hear from the kids, we find out it is different than what we thought. So those components, that community conversations, the youth participation, and then coordinating with all of the various agencies that are in your county are really important. And it really comes from the top as well. We need to have the elected officials and the governing boards be supportive of this, because it's really hard to spend the time and invest the time going to all of these meetings unless the elected officials and the governing boards aren't on board with the process.
And just real quickly, Marita, I would say, as we look at the history of our local Children's Services Council, it takes a couple of very passionate people to get things started. So, even if there are communities without a dedicated source of funding for this kind of stuff, there's always a county, there's a municipality, there may be a United Way. They all have, we all have faith-based organizations. So find a couple of people in those organizations and just start the conversation around what is needed in this space. And, incredible things can happen from that.
And I just want to have...
And it really sounds like... Go ahead. Closing words.
One note of clarity for other communities. So the dedicated funding is a funding stream for Children's Services Council. That's one of the backbone organizations for this effort. But our organization does not provide the sole supported funding for Birth to 22. So I want to make sure that the dedicated funding, that folks understand, that's dedicated funding for our organization. We partner with a network of wonderful organizations, and we're really looking at where are the funds, how are they aligned. And so it was our focus on really this early childhood space that had the county say, okay, so there's an organization that's organizing services and supports in the birth to 5 space and birth to 8 space. How do we do that for middle and high? So we are just one piece of the pipeline. We are not the organization that's funding this entire initiative. There are multiple funding partners at the table. I just want to make sure that that's clear to the audience.
Terrific. Thank you. And you can hear more about all of this at the Ready by 21 National Meeting. And thank you for both the clarifications and the inspiration, I think, to folks who are thinking about or involved in or thinking about tackling this work, because it is about partnerships in all directions, both to top leadership and in the stories that you're telling to really folks who are working on the front line and connecting out to community. The other sessions at the national meeting that are Palm Beach County connected, where you can find out more about these stories, whether it's the equity, the social emotional learning, looking at the partnerships, looking at how it's informed their showing the money, show the funding, all kinds of things that are deeper dives in terms of this work. Did get a couple of questions that were coming just at the very end today, and so yeah, we can read the question to you. Okay, so it seems like you guys have made some great progress, but the local boys and girls clubs are not included. Do you collaborate with local clubs to achieve the desired outcomes of career and academic success, good character and leadership, and healthy lifestyles, including social and emotional development? That's question 1.
Okay, so all the Boys and Girls Club in Palm Beach County are part of our quality improvement system that have been working with Prime Time for years. They are part.
And also, they are part of our access to post-secondary education and our mentoring efforts. They're a real strong partner, as they're touching, lots of youth and helping them succeed throughout, their school trajectory. They are a partner.
They're also funded by the Youth Services Department for some of their summer programs and for the summer employment programs, where they have they're hiring youth to act as camp counselors, and then college students as well come back and act as camp counselors, and Palm Beach County funds that.
So let me ask then a related question. And it's still on the role of the Boys and Girls Club. Our local youth alliance is, and this is from Lynn Bell, our local youth alliance is also looking at developing a community youth development plan. How would you define or quantify community buy-in, and who should buy in? And sort of behind this question is the initiative is being socialized by our local Boys and Girls Club and the Youth Alliance. So in this case, the Boys and Girls Club is playing, it sounds like kind of a catalyst role in terms of some of this work. So how do you find community buy-in, and who should, quote, buy in?
I think that you have to look at your entire community. So as I mentioned earlier, we had 11 community conversations, targeted conversations, but we broke those up based on our commissioner districts. So we tried to go in north, south, west, central parts of our community. And we went to areas that oftentimes had been left out. Nobody was going to ask them, how do they think about funding priorities and setting policy and moving programs and having those services. So you really have to assess the lay of the land in your community, understanding the context and the conditions, and ensure that you have that you're using the right levers to enter into spaces that maybe it's not the Boys and Girls Club. In many instances, we partnered with another local group to do some of the community conversations. So even though we came in as facilitators, they were co-hosted by, say, the city of Del Rey or by another community partner, because they had the trust and value of the community. So I think it's really important that you understand not just your message, but who is your messenger, and to ensure that you have the right set of folks at the table. And if you do that honestly and genuinely and with some transparency, we ensure that when we went out there and asked them what they thought about things, we went back before we minted the youth master plan and said, did we get this right? Is this what you meant? Are you being accurately represented? And the community were like, you're back? Like, you're going to tell us, you're going to make sure that we validate this before you take it to print? That's something that generally funding institutions and nonprofits, especially government, we don't do. we have our focus groups, we do a survey, and we're done. We don't go back. So you really have to build the trust, and that is where you really get buy-in, when people see that you're doing the things that you committed to doing in their communities. They'll join you in your effort. And we've been fortunate to have the community join us and challenge us as well.
Thank you. Thanks, Marcia. And just a footnote to Lynn, this is Marita, the kind of community conversations that they were doing in Palm Beach County, we've just recently done a version of those with a Boys and Girls Club in the city that wanted to have conversations with 4 different neighborhoods that they were working in. It was very similar to what Marcia had talked about. It's like, how do you define kind of the community and the communities within? But those conversations, how are young people doing? What does it look like here in terms of what our community supports are? And then how are we going to improve that picture? Is a common conversation that can happen in many communities, whether it's local neighborhood or looking countywide. I think the very last question was just to clarify, when you're saying is the dedicated funding, although we're now getting more questions coming in. Now it's 3:09 p.m., so we'll see how much time y'all have to hang out here. Dedicated funding, is that from government agencies? So can you explain the term dedicated funding in our story? Marcia?
Okay, so the dedicated funding that we were speaking of is dedicated funding for Children's Services Council. So we're special taxing districts. So CFCs were established. We get a portion of the property tax based on an approved millage rate, and that is how our organization is funded, as well as the other taxing districts that I mentioned throughout the state. So it's ad valorem property taxes, and so our citizens, progressive citizens here in Palm Beach County, voted to say we want to tax ourselves because we think it's so important to have a dedicated organization that's going to be looking at the welfare of children in our communities, and that we will pay a portion of our property taxes to ensure that this organization manages services and supports for kids and their families. And so you saw the picture earlier. I didn't speak to the budget because it was on the page, but we have a pretty sizable budget because, again, we are a wealthy community here in Palm Beach County. And this year, our budget is over $130 million dedicated to support children and youth programming, primarily in the prevention and early intervention space, as I mentioned earlier.
So in addition to Children's Services Council, of course, we have the county, we have United Way, we have foundations that are also part of this work. So, many of us have funding that we reinvest right back into our own community, on behalf of United Way. It's through nonprofit organizations and through initiatives. So, so as Marcia said, Children's Service Council is a large part of that funding, but there are others of us as well that help with some other funding and gap funding as well.
Right. And if you're interested in more the Florida case study, there's going to be a session on that Friday morning, it looks like, at 10 o'clock at the national meeting. And then there are other sessions that Elizabeth Gaines and the team are going to be doing on the Children's Funding Project at the national meeting for places that are interested in doing things like getting getting something on the ballot to be able to have that kind of dedicated tax in their local community. So one more question came in. This one is regarding education support and equity, and asking if the topic of the traditional school calendar came up this school year, and the issue of summer learning loss and how it generates summer learning loss, and also how it disrupts partnerships. Did that come up? Connected to that, that is to the topic of balancing the compulsory to attend school calendar year come up in terms of that. So it's just that disruption that happens in terms of summer.
The topic of the school calendar itself did not come up, and I think all of the partners at this table, along with the school district, would easily say that we keep our partnerships going even during the summer months. There really isn't a break. one of the things that we have developed amongst several of the partners is our summer programs, and we have summer camp scholarships that we put out so that there is the ability. They're funded by both Palm Beach County and the Children's Services Council, and it allows children who may not otherwise be able to afford to go to summer camp be able to get summer camp opportunities. Prime Time is involved in providing some additional supports and making connections with some of those wonderful providers that can do the supplements during the summer and the hands-on experiences. And we do have some educational components in many of those summer camps as well. So although we didn't address the calendar itself, we definitely make sure that our activities continue throughout the summer. And we also make sure that food is supplied during the summer.
Very important.
Fantastic. Yes. So thank you. Thank you again. We had 15 minutes of questions, actually. We didn't know that we had. So thank you all very much, and thank you for those who stayed on. Actually, quite a few did, to really listen to that discussion portion as well. Again, we are looking forward to seeing you all in Palm Beach County, and again, to our guests today, you do fantastic work. Thank you. It's a privilege to work with you, and it's going to be a privilege to be there in much warmer climes in a very short time. We are looking forward to it.
Looking forward to having everyone.
See you soon. Bye.
Bye now.
Thank you all.
Have a safe. Well,
Bye-bye.
Bye.